Hey, sellers, welcome back. This is going to be the first of a series we're going to be throwing in. Usually it'll be Dave and I doing this, but for now, playing solo, I'm just going to do it myself. This is going to be our spent casing segment. So what that is essentially an after scenario analysis, uh, in depth, what worked, what didn't work, things we have identified, just to help anybody else playing this scenario to maybe improve their game or to consider these various points. So I got a long list of stuff to go through, and let's get into it. General impressions of this. It's a long scenario. I mean, it's 15 game turns, of which the Russians conceded in the German turn 10. I estimate it took me probably about 25 hours, give or take, of playtime, all recorded except for the setup part. And then I sped through some of the German movement phases because they took so long to do. So if you add an extra hour of setting up minimum, um, you're looking at least 25 hours. Now the scenario card said upwards of 60. Um, Obviously, it might be different if you're playing on a tabletop with two opponents facing off against each other, constantly referring to your record, your of notes that you have to keep on the side. I could see it maybe pushing that boundary, but um, yeah, for me it took 25 hours to play. So as I said, some of the German movement phases because there's so many vehicles, um, well over 300 victory points worth of equipment on the board. Um, some of the movement phases took well over an hour just to do. You move one vehicle, you have to see what can shoot at it. It gets into place. Do you shoot from it, etc.? Do you overrun? And because I'm not great on a lot of the rules, apparently, looking things up constantly eats into that. Like overruns, example, how does that exactly work for a half track as opposed to a tank versus a truck and a gun and a squad and a crew all in the same location? All those kind of factors that factor in. So it takes a lot of time to do a lot of your movement. Most of the videos I shot were probably on the range of one and a half, almost 2 hours in some cases, of which I condensed them down to the ones that you saw. So you can just appreciate how long it took to actually do that kind of thing. A lot of SSRs to consider. There's 18 for the snare card alone, which if you saw my initial recce, um, uh, we went through most of them here. 18 of them just for this alone, and one of them, of course, is the campaign ones, which are another 10 as well. So um, these are all modifications that George made to some standard rules, adding new countermeasures like Engineer 458s for the Russians as assault engineers, adding the Pleva rule for the OBH hits, and the machine gun nest strong points that the Germans set up. Not to mention things like the Scherzen. This is one that I misplayed the first few turns, but basically it gives you an extra armor factor on any applicable side if it's a 45 millimeter or less gun. So that's quite handy considering all the guns except for their artillery pieces are 45 or less. So ATM support for your MMCs, and then air support, which you could get every turn. So maximum of 15 times 3, 45 aircraft if you're really good in all your die rolls for every turn. So you can get a maximum of 45 aircraft in this scenario, which is just ridiculous. I got three aircraft total out of 10 turns. So just to show you that there's a lot of SSRs that have to be considered. So as a player tackling this scenario, things you should remember: Bangalores can breach wire and mines. Very handy. I didn't use any of my Bangalores, and there's I think I get like six or something like that in the. And you can also exchange a DC for two Bangalores if you so choose. DCs, for their part, can breach trenches. So normally a trench is impassable to wield on armored cars, which is over half of your vehicle complement. Um, so breaching it offers a chance for the vehicles, not just track vehicles, all vehicles to traverse those trenches. And there's so many fortifications, which we're going to get into, that inevitably you're going to have to cross a trench and risk getting bogged down. I never used this aspect because I was playing solo, but you can, as I understand it, you can trade in some of your, 264 mine factors that you get in this scenario for dummy minefields, and or sorry, for known minefields. And then for each known minefield, you can get a variable number of 1 to 3 dummy counters. So you can actually increase almost triple your your minefield counters on the map, and you could cover the whole board almost with a line of white counters. Now you are limited with your setup radius, which we're going to get into as well. But generally speaking, you have enough fortifications, especially mines, to do a bang-up job. As I said, German MMC, you have a chance for ATMM, so if you're going to engage vehicles in combat, make sure you utilize that. It's 43, and normally you don't get them to 44, so it's kind of handy. And again, don't forget the light dust that applies for the first 3 turns because of the bombardment cause. Yeah, so that's a lot to remember, and I probably should have reflected on that between each. Every time I sat down at the computer to play a turn, I should have reread all those SSRs just to refresh them in my mind. A lot of us are getting older, a lot of us are having fading memories, and you may or may not forget certain things, which it could hinder or hamper your ability to complete your objectives. So as I said, the Germans won in turn 10. The Russians conceded. Basically, this is kind of like what we had for the German turn 11. Most of this, at the end of the German turn 10, was stacked along this road junction. 3 vehicles per hex, pretty well. Just all stacked, all in motion, and then on turn 11, all this was able to exit. So I exited a total of 197. Of which I only needed 135. So an extra 60, quick math, 62 CVP were exited because the Russians just were not able to stop them. And that still left all this on the board here, which I never even got to moving. So that was the biggest reason why the Russians conceded, because all they had to stop me, they had 2 AT guns up here. And then they had, because these ones were all gone, crews were destroyed and run over. And they had a 37 long down here that might have been able to tag some of the stuff in the rear. But with the shots I took, and because I charged a tank right into it, it was basically used up all its firepower, and it was just ineffective, completely ineffective. And I was able to get 197 victory points off if I would have played it all the way through to turn 11. So Russians concede in turn 10, and the game is over. And I did this without getting most of my air support. Again, as I said, 10 turns should have been maximum 30 aircraft. I got 3. So 10% of the aircraft that I potentially could have got, I received for this battle. One of which missed their attack because of the light dust rules. It affected their final shot. So if your die rolls are better than mine and you're getting aircraft all the time, I can see why the one ASL Scenario Archive playthrough has the Germans winning or the Russians conceding at like turn 9, just because it's just so overwhelming. And you've only got 437 double longs to ward off the aircraft. But yeah. So what did the Russians have at the end of the game? This is what they had left on the board. These 2 were up in the top left corner. These were buried in the trenches on the right side, which again I'll get into when we get into discussions here. And they only had a few troops left. All 10 T-34 M41s were destroyed prior to the Germans even exiting a single troop off. So not a lot, and the final CVP count total for the whole thing was the 192 to 144. So in addition to getting 197 off the board, uh, I lost 144. Now, if you calculate the Russian loss as 192 with what's left here on the board, uh, the Germans probably have a good 100 plus CVP. Well, let's add it quickly. Yeah, 253 as opposed to close to close to 400 for the Germans. Vastly outnumbered uh, troops. That might be a scenario design limitation, but it was definitely impactful. Um, all right, so that's enough for the general impressions. All right, so this is basically what the kind of setup that I had. This board is for the German setup. Um, I had one strong point center located here, another one here, and the other two were offset like this. Now, there's a limitation in the way that they can be set up, um, and that is because they have to be 13 hexes between strong points. So that's a lot of gaps. Now, you could do different kinds of setups. You could set up something like this. Uh, but then ultimately you're still going to have gaps and channels. So what I decided to do was set up the way I had it so that I can offer maximum coverage on one side. This almost forced the Germans to come to this side, which is exactly what happened. I mean, I'm playing against myself, so obviously it'll be different if you're playing another opponent. But I can't see anybody risking to run through the thickest part of the gauntlet. This is such a slog to get through all this stuff with shots coming at you left and right. It would make sense that you're going to focus your efforts onto the one. So pros for the Russian setup. You've got 264 minefield factors. Now I used all 6 firepower mines, and I was able to litter most of these around here between my first set of fortifications. So definitely a lot of wires and mines to cover the approach before they even get to the trench. So that did slow down the Germans a lot. A lot of my vehicles got bogged down, and troops got stuck on the wire, just unable to get underneath it. So what the only drawback is, because you have to have this kind of a gap between your defenses, you really cannot have a lot of concentration in this one sector where it's your weakest line. Which again, it's a catch-22. Like, do you defend one side really well and weaken one side, or do you defend both sides partially well and leave the center wide open? You know, it could be one or the other. The good thing with this is it forces it through, so I'm pretty much sure where the Germans are going to come through, and I'm able to focus my effort on that. The Russians have a lot of 3 rate of fire guns. With all the 45s are 3 rates. The 76 artillery pieces are a 2, and the 37 longs are 3 as well. Not to mention your tanks, although the tanks don't have any rate of fire at all because they're early war T-34s. You do have a lot of shots coming down on the Germans. Now, I had a lot of high rate of fire tears with the German with the Russian guns, and a lot of German vehicles were immobilized or other effects happened because of all that. OBA is another strong point for the Russians, typical. You get 2 batteries, and because of the pre-registered hex, you start off with 6 black and 2 red chits, which is pretty good. Normally it's a 5 and 2, but 6 and 2 with the start. And because you're using the Pleva rule, you never run out of OBA access. So the way that works, for those that don't know it, and this is the first time I've heard about it myself, is in this scenario. But because OBA plays such a critical role in many scenarios, you can win or lose just for lack of it in some cases. Either for HE purposes or smoke purposes. You need to have this asset in your toolbox to do really well sometimes. So Steve Pleva, and I'm sure others that influenced him, came up with this house ruling, if you will, which it's become more and more popular. Some people aren't fans. I know, Mark Hanna, you're not a fan, but Some guys are fans. And what it does is rather than lose permanent access to your battery for drawing 2 red chits, which is the standard rule, every time you draw a red chit, you're just adding another red chit to the pile, and the red chit you draw goes back into the pile too. So as you can see and appreciate, your chit count goes through the roof on the red side. So in one case, I think I had 2 or 3 black to like 7 red. I was still able to get a black for battery access one time for the Russians, but you're never going to run out of OBA, so there's always a chance that you can pull out of the fire. Cons for the Russians, Panthers and Tigers are just shrugging off the 45 shots. Barring criticals and side shots, which again, given the terrain, it's very easy to get those, but barring those, they just shrugging off the results, and you can have anywhere from 2 to 3 Panthers and 1 to 2, or no, I think 2 Tigers. So that's 5 tanks that are almost invulnerable to all of your guns. Even the 76 long is helpless against the Panther with APCR because it maxes out at, I think, 16 at a 1 or 2x range, and the Panther frontal armor is 18. So you need to get a turret hit, and you have to be really close with the 76 long to have a chance at penning the Panther. So while you have a lot of guns, there's certain drawbacks in that a lot of the German armor is impervious to your, especially the stronger ones. I mean, I use my Panthers to overrun a lot of the guns. I throw them in the front. One got immobilized, I think it was, and the other one of the Tigers as well when I tried to overrun a position. But barring my shitty dice rolls, those are a lot of strong tanks to be doing that. There's a delay in the reinforcements. So Russians get reinforcements. There's 4 potential groups you can get. The last one is a variable mix depending on how you roll. But there's 4 groups of reinforcements you get. They can arrive anywhere between 5 and turn 8. As long as you roll the number superscript here or less for each group. So you have 4 chances of rolling a 1, 4 over 2, and so forth. Nothing came in for the Russians on the 5th turn. I had 2 of the 4 come in on the 6th, and the other 2 arrived in the 7th turn. Now, the 7th turn was my T-34s, which basically confined them to this area here because I was able to push to this line on their move, but the Germans were already in this area. They were past that first line of defenses. Tanks were starting to pour through the breaches there, and even with the smoke OBA covering most of the T-34s, I was still able to wreak havoc with them. And of course, I got air support that turn as well, so I was able to take out 2 more T-34s. So the reinforcements can arrive too late. I need to play test this a lot more if there's a better solution, but it's been play tested by the scenario designers, so I'm sure this is a good mix. And again, it could be a matter of die rolls. If you're really good, you have no problem. If you suck like me, a lot of dice rolls, you're going to come in later and later. And that has a serious weakness because, again, you cannot cover the whole map. You have to concentrate in one area at the detriment to another. And once they're through this line, then it's a free run all the way up to here. And you better hope your reinforcements show up to stem that tide. As I mentioned, a con with your fortifications is having these points set so far apart, obviously for good reason. Otherwise, you would just stack them and it would be impossible to get through. You can't do that. You have to have them 13 hexes apart. And anywhere within 6 hexes of a strong point, you can set up the fortifications for each of the 4 strong points. Each of them are roughly the same. You get about half a dozen troops, 1 or 2 guns, a pillbox with an HMG, and 40 minefields. And the fortifications. All this has to be set up within 6 hexes of each strong point center. So while the points are 13 hexes apart, you can bunch up the troops to a certain degree. Again, I used these activation counters for a Sassel Vassal module to help to show this. But you could line up this strong point all back here, this strong point all up here, this strong point back here, and limit it that way. If I had used these when I set up, I probably would have realized that and I could have done it. But I more or less set up down here. These guys were set up here. These guys were set over here. And of course that one's back there. So probably wasn't an optimal setup. But just bear in mind that you have to have your center points 13 hexes apart, which obviously it won't influence where you can set up your fortifications. So I see this as a con just because it's too dispersed. I mean, there's too many channels for that you're going to be weak. Now, you also have some universal counters. These ones right here, they can be set up anywhere in the Russian setup area. And again, your setup area is basically the top 3 boards. You're not going to have anything over here. Well, you may, but I doubt it. You want to slow them down as much as possible so that your reinforcements can come on and use them as stopgap measures to plug those holes that the Germans are poking through. The Russians only have the 76 plus OBA, so that's battalion mortars guns basically. Which are very ineffective against Russian or German vehicles, again, which is most of the complement coming at you. 3s are what you need. I mean, it's they are open-topped, and they're weak armored, so you can probably get away with the 4 or 5 for the half-tracks, but you have to get them on, and you're never going to usually get more than 1 round of FFE on a group of vehicles because they move so fast. Now, the Germans are hampered because, again, they're going to focus all their efforts in one area, which means there's going to be a lot of density for you to drop an OBA on. So if you pick your pre-registered sites appropriately, like I had a couple here in the channel in case they decided to go through the center, and I had 1 or 2 out here in the wilds, you know, just pre-staging areas, knowing that they're going to eventually run into mines and wire. I want to hit them while they're grouped up to middling effect. But generally speaking, the low chit count, again, it's 6 black and 2 red, which sounds great, but with the Pleva system, you're going to get a lot more reds. It's going to get harder and harder to get OBA, even though you're never going to really lose it. And you have to bear in mind as well the dust from your bombardment board. Now, I chose the front board because my hope was to eliminate a lot of fortifications, middling success because the morale of mines and wire is so high, like a 9 or less, and they're safe. So it's really hard to eliminate a lot of the wires, again, unless your die happen to fall into place. But on whatever board you choose to run your bombardment on, you're going to have light dust and effect for the first 3 turns, which is good and bad, right? Good because it gives you cover so you can move these troops into position to cover the gap. They set up here, but they're not confined there. On the Russian turn, they can start filtering in. These guys I brought into here. These guys filtered into here. These guys began to move up the line to here. It gives a lot of cover for them to take up new positions. The bad side is it affects all your shots, anywhere from 1 to 3, which could be, again, depending on the die rolls, good or bad. I think generally this setup was okay. If I had used these markers like you're seeing here to identify the zones of setup, I might have chosen a bit more widely. I might have set up more in back here so I can connect all 4 sets of trenches. That might have been a better idea. One thing I didn't do was put a trench behind the pillbox. So for example, these ones here, if I bring these on, however they were set up, I had a trench, a pillbox, and a trench. What I should have had is a trench behind it, more trenches to the side, so that whenever you're leaving this, it's directly into a trench. Although you could go side to side, but if there's no trench behind it, this is open ground except for the pillbox, so it's very easy to drive vehicles over here. And once you destroy whatever's inside the pillbox, which is only typically your machine gun, like I said, it's an open ground hex, and it's another point of entry for the Germans to punch through. And you have 1 or 2 of these points of entry per zone, it gets very easy to penetrate your lines. And then they don't have to worry about breaching trenches, which is what I ended up doing. So that was definitely misplayed on my part. When you put your pillboxes, make sure there's a trench behind it as well. Something like this, so that you have a constant set of obstacles which have to be breached for non-tracked vehicles to have a chance of entering. And again, non-tracked vehicles is most of your complement, so something definitely to bear in mind. I do like the way I layered the mines. I mean, I'm playing solo, so it's I know where everything is. I hip them just so that, and I made them unknown so that they're sitting on the board. I know they're there, but I'm going to try and act like I don't know that they're there until I actually run into one, and then I'll become aware, and now I'll start doing searching die rolls, or I'll use my vehicles unattended just to drive through these the minefields. As I said before, there's 264 minefield factors, of which I use 6 firepowers throughout, which is the minimal amount. Now, I probably could have jumped those up to 8 or even 12 and augment my AT mines, maybe make them a 4s. I use 3s for my AT mines. But it's the old catch. Do you litter the whole field with weak mines, or do you pick strong points and put strong mines there? So I chose weak mines to cover most of the field, and it seemed to be fairly. It seemed to work because again the Germans got hung up on the mines or the wire, before they even got into the trench system proper. So it's not a bad idea having weak mines, but again you may want to have stronger ones just so you have a stronger chance of actually impacting an armored vehicle. Because if you lead with your tanks, and the Germans get, what do they get? 8 tanks. Yeah, 8 tanks to start with. So that's a lot of tanks to plow through weak minefields. And again, you need snake eyes to have a chance of immobilizing a tank. And if you're a stronger one, you may actually have a chance of killing it. But aside from that, I think generally speaking, the way I had my defenses layered, I think was good for my strategy that I had. When it comes to the AT guns, I definitely misplaced the ones that were up here. These guys were down here. All this was set up over here somewhere. And I had an AT gun sitting over here, thinking that, if Germans punch through the heaviest part, at least I'll have something there to stop them down, rather than depend upon the trench systems and local troops. I might have been better served to have these AT guns somewhere over here. If I know that I'm going to be pushing the Germans through this way, it would make sense to have my AT guns set up over there, rather than stuck in the back like they were. Just it might have been a better idea to set them up the way I had it, or where I should have had it was bring the AT guns closer to the side so they can help get some cross shots at this. If all your German vehicles are moving this way, heading off the board, that's a lot of flank shots, maybe some rear shots. More likely to pin and destroy the armor, which has a less chance of impacting your reinforcements coming along here. You're sending half tracks against artillery pieces and guns, not just Panthers and Tigers. Might have been better served for that way, but again, it's a trade-off, right? You do have a lot of guns, but you don't have that many guns, and there's only so many areas you can cover. The fact that they're 45s, as I said, was is good against most vehicles, but it's weak against Panthers and Tigers, and frontal armor for most shots. Even with APCR, I think it's an 11 or 12. And, if you have an 8 armor frontal, you're still looking at a 4 or less to get a result, which is not great odds. Again, barring criticals. And assuming you can actually get APCR, which you only have, I think, on a 5 or so for most of those guns. Yeah, 5 for 43. The other thing I did wrong was my OBA, my observers. I naively thought, if I put them inside a bunker, they'll be protected. I can fit them in with a crew and the gun inside the bunker, which is great as long as you're within the covered arc. So once the Germans started pushing through into this area up here, I had no line of sight. I had field phones, so I don't have radios. I have field phones. Something else to bear in mind as a Russian player is how you're going to set up your OBA, because it would have been better served to have an officer in a trench. Trenches are concealment terrain at start, which means you can stay concealed in a trench and you have a 360 view. That would have been a smarter play than to put them in a bunker. So don't put your radios inside a bunker, because once that field phone is set, you cannot move it if you want to use it. So just bear in mind, again, I definitely misplaced that. Uh, some general observations for the Russians before I get to the Germans. So I thought initially with the Pleva rule that the OBA was hampered. Again, you don't have a high chit count to start with. It's only 6 black and 2 red. You draw a red, now you're suddenly 6 and 3, and now you're going to be, before you know it, you're going to be drawing 3 black and like 6 red or more red. And your odds of getting OBA are a lot less, which means you can, while you're never going to lose it, you might have strong fire mission capability at the beginning, but it's going to be less and less as the game goes on. And you really need that OBA to come in and hammer the German troops when they're sitting here. They're still. It took me 6 turns, I think, to reach the trench line. 7 turns, I think I was finally past it, or segments of it. I still had this segment over here that I had to deal with, but generally I was past the trenches. That's 7 turns that if I had placed my observers more smartly, I could have dropped danger close artillery right amongst them right here. Like, it might have been good to actually have my front line of trenches, put one of my pre-registered right on my line of trenches. And that way I can bring direct fire on them once they clear that trench. So that's a smarter application than what I did. So again, this is the first time I've used this Pleva rule. I kind of like it because, again, you're never going to lose access. It just gets harder to get it. So it's not, a game breaker, I don't think. But I need to play with it more to get used to it. Now, I guess George is using a lot of this in the scenarios. And we'll be doing a lot of Lone Canuck publishing scenarios recently, and probably a couple more coming up. So I'm sure we're going to see lots of use of this rule, and we'll get a better feel for if we think it's good or not. Lastly, and it's kind of beyond your control, is the flame spread. So at the beginning, you have a chance of rubbling any of these buildings on this board and or creating flame. Now, I think I had like a half dozen or so flame counters at start. And by the end of it, almost this whole field was on fire. All these buildings here were on fire, and this rubble was starting to catch on fire. So from one perspective, it's good in that it helps to channel the German forces, which is why I had all this fire here. I brought my T-34s in here. So my thought was, this is going to be a wall. He's going to be forced into these choke points. I have a couple of AT guns set up that could help eliminate him. And he brings him closer to this setup area as well, so that I can get some side shots potentially. That was my plan with the Russians. Didn't quite work out that way because I was able to drop smoke on his tanks, and between Stukas and my Panthers and the 75 longs from the Mark IVs, I was able to do a number on his tanks before he could have a chance of hurting me. Again, no rate of fire on his tanks means he only used 1 shot, 2 with intensifier, and correspondingly harder to hit. So you got to be aware of where the flame is, and I actually completely forgot this building was on fire for most of the game. It was unable to pass to these two until near the end, and I completely forgot about this brush as well, which would have gone up on an 8 or more. So that was 10 turns of 8 or more that it potentially had this on fire as well, which basically would have channeled everything through this one point here, or this road to exit off here. This road and this side is almost untenable for the Germans to reach, just given the time constraints and the forces you're facing. But I knew the Germans were going to have to come off this way, and that's what they ended up doing. So the fire was good, but it also hampered me because once my guns were set up, which I admit I set up poorly back here, they should have been set up further along, or I should have just put them in this area here to help support those other two. The fire limits my setup as well as a Russian player, where you can set up your reinforcements. But it's completely out of your hands. It's dependent strictly on the die rolls. No wind change at all in this game, so 10 turns of wind die rolls produce Butkus. Um, if you start adding and drifting smoke, it's a lot more obscuration and hindrances for the Russians to set up, and something else you have to be aware of. So when I set up my gun in this position here on flames on either side of me, great as long as there's no smoke. The slightest little bit of smoke and this gun becomes useless. This gun becomes useless. These guns were effectively useless in the German turn 10 because, again, everything was forced this way. So let's look at the German setup. So German at start, this is what you have. You can just set up on row 6 or less. And, you know, within one move, you're at the edge of the map board. You stop your guys, you start searching for mines because, you know, again, 246 mine factors, there's minefields out there. And I didn't use any known ones. So if you add in known minefields with an extra 1 to 3 dummy counters, that's a lot of blank minefields that you're looking at. You don't know which one's real, which one's dummy, and it slows the Germans down that much more. I might have been better served to look at the Russian again to have dummy minefields in there. But again, when you're playing by yourself, the jig's up. You don't really know what's what. You might forget which ones are real and which ones are not, but eventually you'll... or you could do what I saw George Hoytis do on his. You have a whole bunch of known and dummy counters. You flip them all over to this side, and then you just randomly move them around. Eventually you lose track of which is which. And you can start moving around that way. So you don't even know which one's real, which one's dummy, which is a very valid technique. And I think I'm going to try and remember that the next time I do something similar. But yeah, so German set up on row 6. You have 8 tanks, so everything is covered with a tank. So armored assault is the order of the day for all your forces. Now, you have a couple of guns that you can set up. I had 2 mortars of varying success. One was, that should be on a vehicle. Whatever. I had 2 mortars of varying capability. They had lots of smoke throughout. Because you're Gross Deutschland, one of your keys is you have an increased ammo depletion number. So all your mortars are firing on a smoke of a 9. Normally it's an 8, but because you're Gross Deutschland, it's a 9. So 2 mortars with a high rate of fire, 9 or less, and you're dropping smoke. So you're going to saturate this area with smoke. You've got 2 OBA modules, one you start with and the other one that comes in on turn 3 to saturate the area with smoke. So you have plenty of cover to cover your advance, almost too much. If you really get a high rate of fire on your mortar, it's just blooping smoke rounds everywhere. You're covering all those guns with smoke so they can't fire back at you. Especially for me, I concentrated in this area because I didn't want any of those flank shots coming. So this area was littered with smoke by my guns. That's in the prep fire phase to start off your turn, and then you have, as I said, armored assault. You start moving up. The first guy is going to be your well, I won't use that term. It's probably derogatory. You send your first guy in, armored assault, and next thing you know, he hits a mine. Now you're suddenly aware that there's minefields there, and you start to slow down and do your searches, and you quickly identify the minefields. Once you've identified 1 or 2, then it's just a matter of sending your armored vehicles in through, and hopefully they don't trigger anything, or don't die from a really good die roll. But again, it's a chance game. If you use dummy minefield counters and high value minefields as a Russian, you're more likely to do damage to the guys. But a pro for the Germans is being able to use armored assault because you have so many vehicles. Even the half tracks with their armored is good enough for armored assault. Speaking of half tracks, don't forget the anti-air guns. You're generally crew exposed unless you decide to button up. I always played with them buttoned up. but it's a 3 firepower machine gun, which you can add to any carrying squad and do a fire group that way. So don't forget those. I mentioned the elite status, so all your guns have special ammo increased by 1. So APCR is a 6, not a 5. Some of these have smoke. Yeah, not the ones that start, but the ones that you have coming on board do have smoke capability increased, as well as APCR capability. So very handy to remember, especially when not so much at the beginning, although you can use them against pillboxes, but more or less when the T-34 start rolling in, you definitely want to have a lot of APCR shots to help beat that frontal armor of 11. 50 longs, again, like the 45s, not really going to do the business on a T-34. That's where your Panthers and your Tigers come in, and the other 75 longs that show up as part of your reinforcements. What else? You got mobile spotters for your radios. That's how I use them. Now, I pretty well kept my OP tanks back in this terrain here. When I brought my 105 guy in, he came in and landed over here. But it's mobile, so you can, once he's done saturating this area with smoke and HE, you can waste a turn while your smoke goes down to +2. You can get closer to the action, you're protected. Even if your crew exposed, you still get a +2 to your armor. An SSR for the mobile tank is they use like the radio of the tank, so they only break down on a 12. And because I think part of this is tied to the Pleva rule, the way George Callan wrote this scenario is that you don't permanently lose radio access. So even if you roll a 12, it's only malfunctioned. It's never going to be permanently disabled. So in this game, you're never going to lose the ability to potentially have OBA on the board. So that's definitely a pro for the Germans. You're probably mostly going to use smoke. You want to, at the beginning, smoke off all these guns, guess 45s, 76 infantries, but they're still going to do a business on you, even heat ammo or APCR for the 45s. It's going to do a number on you because at the beginning you've only got these 6 frontal armor tanks, 3 on the sides. Yes, up armored, but that's only a 4 on the sides, and the pen for 45 is a 10. So 50% chance of getting 6 or less on a side shot up armored turret. So you want to smoke this off as much as possible so you can approach your designated target whichever way you decide to breach the defensive line. Air support. As I said, you can have in 15 turns of play upwards of 45 maximum aircraft. You can get anywhere from 1 to 3 per turn, as long as you roll the right number. Now, for the first 5 turns, you need a 3 or less on the white die to get aircraft. From 6 to 15, it's 2 or less, so it gets harder. So 50% of the time, you're probably not going to have aircraft, and then it goes down to 33% for the turn 6 plus. So air support's not guaranteed, but you have a really good chance of getting it. I suck at getting air support apparently in this because I only got 3 aircraft out of a possible 30, as I said before. 10%. So that's not a lot of aircraft. And the first one I got arrived on turn 3, so the dust was still in play, which meant it ended up missing its target. So I wasn't even able to blow up a gun, which probably caused me some more grief as time went on. So air support is definitely a key, especially if you're lucky enough to get that 33% chance in the latter part of the game when the T-34 start rolling in. If you can get constant air support, they're much easier to deal with, let alone the guns that are out there. Again, because as a German attacker, the Russian has to account for all your approaches. You as a German can pick where you want to attack. I chose what I thought was the weakest part of the line, and rather than the in-depth positions. But you can very easily go through this, knowing that he's probably set up mines and guns to cover his lapse. Something certainly you could consider. I chose the weakest point. It seemed the most obvious. With my superior mobility with all my vehicles, it's much easier to punch through. The pre-game bombardment was not as effective as I thought it would be. I was just rolling really badly. My morale checks were too high. A lot of units didn't break. A lot of fortifications remained, especially minefields. I was able to clear a couple channels, which proved handy, but most of the minefields and wire remained in place. But if you get good pre-game bombardment, it definitely helps your case. So let's look at some of the cons for the Germans. Um, you can think of these as cons, or you can think of them as assets, I suppose. For me, they look to be cons. For the Germans, there are so many different troop types, vehicle types. A lot of rules to remember. This scenario is not for the faint of heart. So if you've never played OBA and air support and armor, if you're coming from starter kit, for example, this is obviously not the one to jump into because you're going to get it all. The infantry overruns, uh, danger close artillery, Stukas, you have dust rules, and all the rest of it. And that's not even accounting for the special rules for the different units that you have access to. As a result, it's easy to overlook minor assets. I know I missed many shots that I could have taken, especially once all my reinforcements were on board. Half the counters were under motions, some of them were buttoned up, some of them were not. What shot, what didn't shoot. Now, as I said before in my comments, the videos to response to questions, I really can't see how this is played on the tabletop. There's just so much density. Every hex has a troop. The Germans are clustered, literally clustered in this area for most of the first 7 turns, and then in this area for most of the last 4 or 5 turns. Clustered, and there's just no way around it. You have so much shit that you have to get them off the board. You inevitably have to be side by side with another vehicle or troop, and it's easy to overlook something, so that you have to slow down. So when I say it took 25 hours to play this scenario, maybe I should have taken longer with my decisions. Clearly, I should have, but it's easy to overlook things. So using something like Vassal, where you can link your acquisition, and again, there was so much acquisition. Which guns had it, which guns didn't have it. Uh, Again, it's hard to envision this on the table, although apparently that playthrough on Scenario Archive was done on the table. Kudos to you guys. Um, for me, I don't think I could play it like that. It'd just be overwhelming. Which again could be good, could be bad. Some guys like that kind of mess. For my mind, I need to slow things down a lot. Um, because of that density, if you're a strict by the rules kind of guy, no going back. Once you bypass something, then you're gonna miss a lot of shots. You're gonna forget to do rolls in a certain order. Like me, I was bouncing around between uh, 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 HE missions, smoke missions, uh, OBA missions, before ordnance smoke missions, that kind of stuff. Just because I tend to work on a left to right kind of basis because there's so much stuff out there. It's just easier to keep track of this. I know that everything over here is done. I can focus on this area, and as a result, you have to do stuff out of sequence. But if you're playing strictly by the rules with an opponent, which you really should anyways, there's no excuse for it. Maybe you can get away with it when you're solo, but when you're playing against an opponent, that's what the rules are there for. You're going to forget a lot of stuff, and that could seriously hamper your efforts. So again, you're going to have to go very slow and methodically through your ASOP and your units to make sure you got everything in order required. Um, a con for the air support, yeah, it's really great if your dies are good, but you really have a 50% chance or less to get air support. And again, it dwindles down to 33% from turn 6 to 15. So the later the game gets, the harder it is to get aircraft. As I said, I only got 3 in the whole game. It would have been nice to get at least 1 or 2 more just on the odds, but the odds were not in my favor for that. So that's the pros and cons for the Germans. Overall, the German OBA was extremely accurate and helpful. I used it for smoke, so just saturate the area with smoke. Near the end, I brought in one HE mission to help decimate those troops and T-34s I rolled in. I caught my own troops in it at the same time, but it was one of those danger close scenarios where you You have to cause some kind of carnage, and that's what it was used for. But generally speaking, I use smoke for my OBA, and because Germans have a an 8-to-3 black to red chit ratio, you're more than likely going to get a lot of black access chits. Yes, your reds are going to start increasing. At one point, I was 6 and 6, but you're still more than likely than not at the early phases to get a lot of black access chits. Um, so that was really good. Light dust, much like for the Russians, pros and cons. It covers your approach, but it also hinders your own shots, makes them that much less effective. So when you're buttoned up and you're trying to hit something in a trench that you may have smoked off, you can see how difficult it gets to hit anything. Studying task checks for aircraft, hits with aircraft, all that plays into it. So it's very easy to miss your shots. Yeah, again, you cover your approach, but if you're not hitting anything, it's going to be there for you when the dust settles. Uh, Generally speaking, I forgot a lot of the SSRs. Um, I thought I'd remember them, and then I'd realize afterwards, wow, Bangalore's can remove mines and wire. Who'd have thunk it? I didn't use any of my Bangalores. DCs, they can breach trenches so other non-track vehicles can pass through. Completely forgot about that one. Um, One time I actually forgot to add an engineer platoon to the reinforcement list. I'm entitled to one, but I didn't even put it on the board. So I compensated by putting it on the last row of vehicles. But they probably would have been at the front to lead the way. That's obviously my part in this fiasco. But even despite that, all my missteps, again, I was able to get 197 CVP CVP off the board. So that's basically the German assault covered. Lastly, just want to look at the reinforcements that came on. So let's look at the Russians first. As I said, I think I misplaced or misplayed these 4 groups of reinforcements. Again, this last one here is variable depending. You get one of these 3 depending on what you roll. I rolled the highest one, which was 10 T-34s and 10 527s coming on as riders. And preceding them, I had this show up. Now, I completely misplayed these engineers. They all died. I brought them in, chugging down here. This is the first truck that blew up. It took one squad with it. The other squads, I then naively tried to make it into the trench system so they could help fight this off, even though this had already failed. What I probably would have been better served to do is to move them into this area, have them sitting in trees, strong points, wait for vehicles to come by, and then attack. That would have been a much better use of their capabilities. But I didn't. I brought them into the trench system. And then, once all my vehicles were past them, I got out of the trench and I charged across open ground with a DC, thinking I could throw it on top of them and destroy the vehicles that way. Of course, none of them made it. So that was a horrible mismanagement of those engineer resources. Sorry, fellas. But that's just the way it was. The AT guns. So they get 4 45 long AT guns, which came in last. No, yeah, they came in last. I had 2 up here, and then I had 2 in here because I knew these were going to be choke points. I might have been better served to send my armor down here with my troops and set up all 4 guns in this area here. I know that this is going to be a deterrence for the Germans. You know, of course, the caveat being is if they defeated the tanks and the troops, then it's wide open and unopposed. So maybe I can sacrifice 1 gun here. But my 45s, I definitely should have set up in this area here. Danger close shots. Set them up here on these intersections. And you're basically covering all your approaches. Anything that approaches with a high rate of fire, you're probably going to do a decent amount of damage. The 76 artillery pieces, again, we had 4 of those. All right, so these 76 longs, they could have been placed possibly better. Again, if I don't know when my reinforcements are going to show up as a Russian. I was lucky enough to get the artillery pieces and the engineers. As I said, I misplayed the engineers. And these probably could have been set up a little bit better. I could have set up, knowing that this is going to be a blaze, I could have set my 4 artillery pieces along this side, which covers this area here where the Germans are coming up. I'll wait for my vehicles to roll on, my tanks. My tanks can support the artillery pieces so they're not by themselves. And meanwhile, my engineers and my AT guns could sit up in this little hamlet, either in the buildings or put the guns in the road intersections. Again, this is going to be dependent on where the blazes are, but by turn 7 or 8, I had a good indication that all this grain was going to burn. This area here was starting to burn as well. It limits the German options, so knowing that, I should have set up my AT guns a little bit better. Maybe not as forward so much, just wait for them back here. That might be a better option. So as a general rule, I think I misplayed the Russian reinforcements. Between the artillery pieces, slightly off position, misplacing the 45s, and throwing all my tanks in a cluster to get smoked out. Something I should bear in mind too is these T-34s are normally radioless, except in 43 onwards, radio tanks, I mean they have to move in platoons. In 1943 and onwards, they are no longer radioless tanks, and they have radios, which means they can move independently. Something I didn't really think about or consider, but you might be better served maybe to break them up into 2 troops, send half of your 10 tanks down here, maybe the other 5 back as a mobile reserve that you can use to punch in through things, or some other combination thereof. You could send all your troops up forward. Maybe if they come in turn 5, you can even drop them off here so they can start digging in trenches and then retreat to become that mobile reserve. There's different ways of playing your forces than what I ended up doing. And obviously that would change the way things maybe happen. So something to consider for the Russian reinforcements. When it comes to the German reinforcements, as I said, I rolled this second group and everything was fine and well. I also got this came on turn 3 and this came on in turn 7. And like I said, in turn 7, I completely forgot this part of my reinforcement group. They should have joined the troops coming on board. Again, look at your orders of battle. Obviously, that's my fault, but look at your orders of battle. Make sure you're utilizing every last troop that you're entitled to, because it really goes a long way. Now, having said that, because you have so many victory points as a German over your Russians, almost 2 to 1, this wasn't a critical oversight as much as it could have been. But who knows, depending how the slaw goes, this might come in very handy, especially if I remember that DCs can breach trenches. If I'm in the trench system by turn 5 to 7, when my engineers start breaching these, would be a good time to remember to use your engineers for that particular purpose. This has been an in-depth spent casings on scenario Großdeutschland number 20, the nut that is Cherkaskoye. It's in the Lone Canuck Publishing Großdeutschland scenario pack number 3. I think overall it's a robust, healthy scenario. I don't know about the balance. It's from the 2 playthroughs I'm aware of, mine plus another one. The Russians caved in too easily. I don't know if that has to do with setup or just bad luck and die rolls. I don't know about the balance. I think there might be too many Germans in relation to the Russians. Again, it makes me want to replay this again just to see if I get a different result, which maybe I will anyways. Who knows? But overall, I still think it's a good scenario. It definitely needs, I think, to be played a lot more. I would love to see more results. So if you see this video and you've tried the scenario, by all means, please comment in the comments down below. If you've played this, make sure that you record your results on Scenario Archive and Roar. I'm going to be doing that shortly. Even though it's a solo playthrough, it still adds value, I think, to the overall knowledge awareness for the scenario. Hopefully you find this interesting. Let me know what you guys think about spent casings as a format. I know other channels do something similar. I know Stu does his advance before he even plays, which is what our initial recce is supposed to mimic. Um, Obviously, it's going to be our take on it, but if you find value in this kind of thing, I like to think that it's going to provide some information for somebody that hasn't tested this scenario or played it, something to consider. Yeah, that's enough for me now, I think. We'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.